An elderly black woman discovers a hateful message scrawled on her door. Leave. It was left by her racist neighbor. What he doesn't realize, however, is that she is now his new landlord. What happens next will astonish even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. Mabel Jones, an elderly black woman, had recently moved into a suburban neighborhood where most residents were white. After years of struggle and saving, she had finally achieved her dream of owning a home. She hoped to find peace and start a new chapter in her life. Living on a nearby street was Jim Randall, a 45-year-old man who took great pride in what he saw as the purity of his neighborhood. The sight of his new neighbor filled him with immediate resentment. He decided that Mabel posed a threat to the way things had always been. Over the following days, Jim repeatedly watched her as she settled into her new home, his frustration growing each time. One night, emboldened by alcohol and fueled by his prejudices, Jim grabbed a can of spray paint. Under the cover of darkness, he scrawled the word "Leave" in large white letters across Mabel's front door. Satisfied with his work, he returned home, completely unaware of the ripple effects his actions would soon have. The next morning, Mabel stepped onto her porch to water her flowers. She froze, her eyes locking onto the hateful message. It cut deep, an unwelcome reminder that even in this new chapter, hatred could follow her. But Mabel wasn't someone who backed down easily. Instead of retreating, as Jim might have hoped, she took a photo of the graffiti and called the police. When the officer arrived, his response was dismissive. "Could have been anyone, ma'am," he said, jotting down her statement with little care. It was clear to Mabel that her concerns were not being taken seriously. Determined not to let the incident be ignored, she reached out to her niece, Linda, a social media activist. Linda wasted no time posting the photo online, captioned, "Racism at our doorstep. This is my Aunt Mabel's story. We will not stay silent." The post quickly gained traction, garnering hundreds of shares and comments within hours. Strangers rallied to show their support, expressing outrage at the act of hatred and demanding justice. Meanwhile, Jim watched from his window, smirking as he observed the commotion at Mabel's house. He was pleased with himself, oblivious to the fact that his actions had already become a hot topic online and that his life was about to change forever. That same day, Linda's post began to go viral. The photo of the door bearing the hateful message, "Leave," became a rallying symbol in the fight against racism. Support poured in through comments as people expressed solidarity with Mabel, offered assistance, and demanded justice. Journalists started reaching out to Linda to learn more about the situation. Meanwhile, Jim basked in what he thought was a victory. He believed the message on the door would intimidate Mabel into leaving. But his plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of fear, Mabel felt a renewed determination to defend her right to live in the neighborhood. Not only did she decide to stay, but she also resolved to confront her neighbors and clarify her stance. The next day, Mabel organized an impromptu gathering on her front lawn and invited all the neighbors. The turnout was larger than expected, and among those present was Jim. He arrived with a sneer, expecting to publicly humiliate Mabel. But once again, his plans went awry. Inspired by Mabel's story and her courage, many neighbors voiced their support for her. Some admitted they were outraged by the incident, but had been too afraid to act. A young man named Ryan stood up and declared, "We can't let hate tear this community apart. This is our home, and it should be safe for everyone." Feeling his grip on the situation slipping, Jim interrupted, shouting, "You people don't get it. This neighborhood has always been peaceful, and now people like her are going to ruin it." His words sparked an uproar. Disapproving murmurs rippled through the crowd, and one neighbor bluntly retorted, "Jim, you're the problem with this neighborhood." After the meeting, Mabel gave an interview to a journalist who had come to cover the story. Her story quickly made its way to local television, sparking a broader discussion about racism in suburban areas. Jim, watching the news from his home, began to panic. He hadn't imagined his actions would lead to such widespread attention and backlash. But the biggest blow came on the third day. The property management company, through which Jim rented his home, contacted him to inform him that his lease would soon be under review. What Jim didn't know yet was that the new owner of his house was none other than Mabel Jones. The news that Mabel Jones had become the new owner of his home hit Jim Randall like a bolt of lightning. He couldn't believe that the elderly woman he had tried to humiliate now held the deed to his house. The property management company had delivered a letter from Mabel, notifying him of an upcoming meeting to renegotiate the terms of his lease. Frustrated and desperate, Jim tried contacting the management company, but the manager informed him that all decisions would now go through the new owner. For the first time in a long while, Jim felt a complete loss of control. His anger gave way to panic as he realized how difficult it would be to find alternative housing if he were forced out. Meanwhile, Mabel was preparing for another community gathering to discuss plans for improving the neighborhood. She saw this as an opportunity not only to reshape her neighbors' perceptions, but also to demonstrate that change was possible. Her efforts were supported by activists, representatives of local organizations, and even a few initially skeptical neighbors. On the day of the meeting, Jim showed up despite his simmering rage, hoping to negotiate some sort of compromise. However, his plan unraveled the moment Mabel began to speak. With grace and dignity, she explained that she bore no ill will toward anyone, but would no longer tolerate discrimination. "This house is part of my legacy," she said to the gathered crowd, "and I want it to be a symbol of change." Ryan, the young neighbor who had already voiced his support for Mabel, stood up again and addressed Jim directly. "Jim, it's time for you to rethink your views. You're the only one here ruining the neighborhood. We need to work together to make it better." His words were met with applause, leaving Jim feeling cornered and isolated. But instead of humiliating Jim in public, Mabel offered him an unexpected resolution. "Jim," she said calmly, "I don't want to evict you, but I insist that you complete a racial equity education program. That's my only compromise. You can stay in the house if you agree to my terms." Jim was stunned. On one hand, the proposal felt degrading to him, but on the other, it gave him a chance to keep his home. Under mounting pressure from the community and the looming threat of eviction, he reluctantly agreed. What Jim didn't realize was that this decision would mark the beginning of. Jim reluctantly agreed to Mabel's terms and enrolled in a racial equity education program. On the first day, he arrived with a stony expression, convinced it was just a formality. However, the program began with a documentary about systemic racism, and it shook him. The stories of people like Mabel, who had endured injustice their entire lives, left him questioning his beliefs. During one session, participants shared personal stories. A neighbor Jim had always considered friendly revealed how her family had suffered from discrimination. Her vulnerability and pain took him by surprise. Gradually, he began to see that the issues he had dismissed as exaggerated were real and deeply damaging. Meanwhile, changes were unfolding in the neighborhood. Mabel, using her position as the new landlord of several properties, spearheaded improvements for the entire community. She organized the renovation of the local park, recruited volunteers to mentor children, and launched a neighborhood mutual aid group. Her efforts inspired many neighbors who started actively supporting her initiatives. Despite his initial resistance, Jim began to notice the positive impact of these changes. One day, he saw children of different ethnicities playing together in the newly refurbished park. The scene reminded him of his own childhood, a time before divisions seemed so prominent in his mind. As the program neared its conclusion, Jim was asked to give a speech about what he had learned. He stood nervously in front of the group, fidgeting with his notes. Finally, he spoke. "I was wrong. All these years I thought I was protecting my home and my way of life, but I see now that I was the one tearing everything down. Thank you, Mabel, for giving me the chance to understand the truth." His words marked a turning point not only for Jim, but for the entire community. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent began openly supporting one another. Jim became an active participant in community projects, helping with initiatives spearheaded by Mabel. For Mabel, the story ended in triumph. Her home became a symbol of change, and her resilience and courage became a beacon of hope. She showed that hatred and ignorance could be overcome with patience, determination, and the willingness to fight for what is right, his own transformation.